Told you, we here. First of all, God bless y'all. We got, God bless me. God bless the world. We here. It's Martin Luther King content. I told you I was gonna give it to you. Happy Martin Luther King's Day to everyone. Shout out to our hero, Martin Luther King, who made the pathway for all of us. Without him, wouldn't have been no Stingray Cool, no Mark Henry, no Ron Simmons, no Malcolm X, no Marcus Garvey, no Mark Eddie Murphy, Martin Lawrence, Goody Mob, Bone Thugs Harmony, 3 6 Mafia, Triple Darkness. You know, Triple Six Mafia, Triple Darkness, see, Tech Nine, none of these people have been do what they do. Wouldn't have had an actress who played the first ever black actress in Star Trek, you know. Wouldn't been no Samuel Jackson, Wesley Snipes, Michael John White, and people like that. So here we go. Talk about the man, the myth, the legend, Martin Luther King. Happy. Here we go. Martin Luther King Jr. born Michael King Jr. January 15th, 1929. He died April 4th, 1968. He was an American Baptist minister and activist. No, he's a Baptist like me. An activist who became the most visible spokesman and leader of the American Civil Rights Movement from 1955 into his assassination in 1968. Renamed after German reformer Martin Luther, King advanced civil rights through nonviolence and civil disobedience, inspired by his Christian beliefs and nonviolent activism of Mahatma Gandhi. He was the son of early civil rights activist and minister Martin Luther King Sr. He was the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, you know, in office from January 10th, 1957, all the way to April 4th, 1968. Succeeded by Ralph Albany. Personal details. He was born, of course, Michael King Jr., January 15th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, U.S. He died April 4th, 1968, at the age of 39, in Memphis, Tennessee, U.S. Cause of death, assassination by a gunshot. Rest in place, Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park. Spouse, Coretta Scott King. They've been married since 1953. Children, Yolanda, Martin, Dexter, and Bernice. Parents, Martin Luther King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. Relatives, Kristen King Ferris, his sister. Alfred Daniel Williams King's Alfred Daniel Williams King, brother. Alveda King, niece. Education, Morehouse College, Birmingham, Alabama. I think that's what the BA stand for. Crozer Theological Seminary, BDIV, Boston University, PhD, occupation, Baptist minister, activist, known for civil rights movement, peace movement, awards, Nobel Peace Prize 1964, Presidential Medal of Freedom, posthumously 1977, Congressional Gold Medal posthumously 2004, memorials, Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. King participated and led marches for colored people's rights to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other civil rights. King led the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott and later became the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, you know, the SCLC. As president of the SCLC, he led the unsuccessful Albany movement in Albany, Georgia, and helped organize some of the nonviolent 1963 protests in Birmingham, Alabama. King helped organize the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The SC, the SCLC put into practice the tactics of nonviolent protest with some success by strategically choosing the methods and places in which protests were carried out. There were several dramatic standoffs with segregationist authorities who sometimes turned violent. Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) Director J. Edgar Hoover considered King a radical and made him an object of the FBI's contemplative, whatever that is. From 1963, four FBI agents investigated him for possible Communist ties, recorded his external affairs and reported on them to government officials. In the 1964 mailed King a threatening anonymous letter, which he interpreted as an attempt to make him commit suicide. On Object 14, 1964, on October 14, 1964, King won the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial inequality through nonviolent resistance. In 1965, he helped organize two of the three Selma to Montgomery marches. In his final years, he expanded his focus to include observation, observation towards poverty, capitalism, and the Vietnam War. In 1968, King was planning a national occupation of Washington, D.C. to be called the Poor People's Campaign. When he was assassinated on April 4th in Memphis, Tennessee, his death was followed by riots in many U.S. cities. Allegations that James Earl Ray, the man convicted of killing King, had been framed or acted in concert with government agents persist for decades after the shooting. King was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977 and the Congressional Gold Medal in 2003. Martin Luther King Jr. Day was established as a holiday in cities and states throughout the United States beginning in 1971. What we are celebrating today. The holiday was enacted at the federal level by legislation signed by President Ronald Reagan in 1986. Hundreds of streets in the U.S. have been renamed in his honor, and the most populous county in Washington State was rededicated to for him. The Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. was dedicated in 2011. Early life and education. The birth. King was born Michael King Jr. on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, the second of three children to Michael King and Alberta King, Nee Williams. King had an older sister, Christine King Ferris, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel A.D. King. King's maternal grandfather, Adam Daniel Williams, who was a minister in rural Georgia, moved to Atlanta in 1893 and became pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in the following year. Williams was of African Irish descent. You know, he was half Irish, half African. Williams married Jenny Celeste Parks King Sr., who was born to sharecroppers James Albert and Delilah King in Stockbridge, Georgia. All right, in his adolescent years, King Sr. left his parents' farm and walked to Atlanta, where he attained a high school education and enrolled in Morehouse College to study for entry to the ministry. King Sr. and Alberta began dating in 1920 and married on November 20th, 1920. Hold up. Yeah, and married on November 25th, 1926. And to Jenny's death in 1941, they lived together on the second floor of her parents' two-story Victorian house where King was born. Shortly after marrying, Alberta King Sr. became assistant pastor of the Ebenezer Church. Senior Pastor Williams died in the spring of 1931, and that fall, King Sr. took the role where he would be where he would in time raise the attendance from 600 to several thousand. In 1934, the church sent King Sr. on multinational trip to Rome, Tunisia, Egypt, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, then Berlin for the meeting of the Baptist World Alliance (BWA). The trip also included visits to sites in Germany associated with the Reformation leader Martin Luther. While there, King Sr. witnessed the rise of Nazism. In reaction, the BWA conference issued a resolution that stated this Congress deplores and condemns as a violation of the law of God, the Heavenly Father, all racial amenities and every form of oppression or unfair discrimination towards the Jews, toward colored people, or toward subject races in any part of the world. He returned home in August 1934, and at that time changed his name to Martin Luther King and his sons to Martin Luther King Jr. His early childhood, you know, that's Martin Luther King's house in Georgia. As childhood home, King and his two siblings would read out loud the Bible as in, as introduced by their father. After dinners, their King's grandmother, Jenny, who he affectionately referred to as Mama, would tell lively stories from the Bible to her grandchildren. King's father would regularly use whippings to discipline his children. At times, King Sr. would also have his children whip each other. King's father later remarked King was the most peculiar child. Basically, he was different, unique. Whenever you whipped him, he'd stand there and tears would run down and he'll never cry. Once, when King witnessed his brother's AD emotional upset his sister Christine, he took a telephone and knocked out AD with it. When he and his brothers were playing at their home, AD slid from a banister and hit into their grandmother Jenny, causing her to fall down unresponsive. King, believing her dead, blamed himself and attempted suicide by jumping from the second story window. Upon hearing that his grandmother was alive, King rose and left the ground where he had fallen. King became friends with a white boy whose father owned a business across the street from his family home. In September 1935, when the boys were about 6 years old, they started school. King had to attend a school for black children, Young Street Elementary School, while his close playmate went to a separate school for white children only. Soon afterwards, the parents of the white boy stopped allowing King to play with their son, stating to him, "We are white and you are colored." When King relied the happen had the happenings to his parents, they had a long discussion with him about the history of slavery and racism in America. Upon learning of the hatred, violence, and oppression that black people had faced in the U.S., King would later state that he was determined to hate every white person. His parents instructed him that it was his Christian duty to love everyone. King witnessed his father stand up against segregation and various forms of discrimination. Once, when stopped by a police officer who referred to King as boy, King's father responded sharply that King was a boy, but he was a man. When King's father took him into the shoe store in downtown Atlanta, the clerk told them they needed to sit in the back. King's father refused, stating, "We either buy shoes sitting here or we won't buy any shoes at all." Before taking King and leaving the store, he told King afterwards, "I don't care how long I have to live with this system, I will never accept it." In 1936, King's father led hundreds of African Americans in civil rights march to the City Hall in Atlanta to protest voting rights discrimination. King later remarked that King Sr. was a real father to him. King memorized and sang hymns and stated verses from the Bible. By the time he was 5 years old, over the next year, he began to go to church events with his mother and sing hymns while he played piano. To sing. To, his favorite hymn to sing was "I Want to Be More and More Like Jesus." He moved attendees with his singing. King later became a member of the junior choir in his church. King employed opera and played the piano. As he grew up, King gathered a large vocabulary from reading dictionaries and occasionally used his expanding lexicon. He got into physical altercations with boys in his neighborhood, but often used his knowledge of words to stymie fights. King showed a lack of interest in grammar and spelling, a trait that he carried throughout his life. In 1939, King sang as a member of his church choir in slave costume for the all-white audience at the Atlanta premiere of the film Gone with the Wind in September 1940. At the age of 11, King was enrolled at Atlanta University Laboratory School for the 17th for the 7th grade. While there, King took violin and piano lessons and showed keen interest in history and English classes. On May 18, 1941, when King had sneaked away from studying at home to watch a parade, King was informed that something had happened to his maternal grandmother. Upon returning home, he found out that she had suffered a heart attack and died while being transported to a hospital. He took the death very hard and believed that his deception of going to see the parade may have been responsible for God taking her. King jumped out of the second story window at his home, but again survived an attempt to kill himself. His father instructed him in his bedroom that King should not blame himself for her death and that she had been called home to God as part of God's plan that could not be changed. King struggled with this and could not fully believe that his parents knew his grandma where his grandmother had gone. Shortly thereafter, King's father decided to move the family to a two-story brick home on a hill that overlooked downtown Atlanta. Oh. This high school King attended. Yeah. Look, a nice fancy high school. To his adolescent years, he initially felt resistant resentment against whites due to the racial humiliation that he, his family, and his neighbors often had to endure in the segregated South. In 1942, when King was 13 years old, he became the youngest assistant manager of a newspaper delivery station for the Atlanta Journal. That year, he skipped the ninth grade and was enrolled in Booker T. Washington School, where he maintained a B plus average. The high school was the only one in the city for African American students. It had been formed after local black leaders, including King's grandfather Williams, urged the city government of Atlanta to create it. While King was brought up in a Baptist home, King grew skeptical of some Christianity's claim as he entered adolescence. He began to question the illiterates teaching preached at his father's church. At the age of 13, he denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus. During Sunday school, King said he found himself unable to identify with emotional display and justice from congregants frequent at his church and doubt if he would ever attend personal sanctification from religion. He later stated at this point, he later stated at this point of his life, doubts began to spring forth unrelentingly. In high school, King became known for his public speaking ability with a voice that had grown into a auto-tune baritone. He proceeded to join the school's debate team. King continued to be most drawn to history and English and chose English and sociology, soli- sociology, sociology to be his main subjects. While at the school, King maintained an abundant vocabulary, but he relied on his sister Christine to help him with his spelling while King assisted her with math. They studied in this manner routinely until Christine's graduation from high school. King also developed an interest in fashion, commonly adorning himself with well-polished patent leather shoes and tweed suits, which gained him the nickname Tweed or Tweety among his friends. He further grew a liking for flirting with girls and dancing. His brother AD later remarked he kept flittering from chick to chick, and I decided I couldn't keep up with him. Yeah, yeah. He kept flirting with chick from chick to chick, and I decided I could not keep up with him, especially since he was crazy about dances and just about the best jitterbug in town. On April 13th, 1944, his junior year, King gave his first public speech during a oral, oratical, ah, oratical contest sponsored by the Improv Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the World of Dublin, yeah, Elks of the World of Dublin, Georgia. In his speech, he stated, "Black America still wears chains. The finest Negro is at the mercy of the meanest white man. Even winners of our highest honors face the class color bar." King was selected as the winner of the contest. On the ride home to Atlanta by bus, he and his teacher were ordered by the driver to stand so that white passengers could sit down. The driver of the bus called King a black son of a B word. King initially refused but complied after his teacher told him that he would be breaking the law if he did not follow the directions of the driver. As all the seats were occupied, he and his teacher was forced to stand on the rest of the drive back to Atlanta. Later, King wrote of the incident saying, "That night will never leave me memory. It was the angriest I have ever been in my life." And Morehouse College, during King's junior year in the high school, Morehouse College, an all-male, historically black college that King's father and yeah, see, and maternal grandfather had attended, began accepting high school juniors who passed the school's entrance examination. As World War II was underway, many black college students had been enlisted in the war, decreasing the numbers of students at Morehouse College, so the university aimed to increase their student numbers by allowing junior high school students to apply. In 1944, at the age of 15, King passed the entrance examination and was enrolled at the university for the school season at autumn. In the summer before King started his freshman year at the Morehouse, he boarded a train and his friend Emmett Weasel Proctor and a group of other Morehouse College students to work in Simbursy, Connecticut, at the tobacco farm of Coleman Brothers Tobacco, a cigar business. This was King's first trip outside of the segregated South into the integrated North. In a June 1944 letter to his father, King wrote about the difference that struck him between the two parts of the country. On our way here, we saw some things I had never anticipated to see. After we passed Washington, there was no discrimination at all. The white people here are very nice. We go to any place we want to and sit anywhere we want to. The students worked at the farm to be able to provide for the educational costs at Morehouse College, as the forum had partnered with the college to allot their salaries towards the university tuition, housing, and other fees. On weekdays, the King and the other students worked in the fields picking tobacco from 7 a.m. to at least 5 o'clock p.m. and during temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit to earn roughly USD number dollars for per day on Friday evenings. King and the other students visited downtown Simsbury to get milkshakes and watch movies. And on the Saturdays, they would travel to Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford, Connecticut, to see theater performances, shop, and eat in restaurants. On each Sunday, they would go to Hartford to attend church service at the church spire filled with white congregants. King wrote to his parents about the lack of segregation in Connecticut, relying how he was amazed that they could go to one of the finest restaurants in Hartfield and that Negroes and whites go to the same church. He played freshman football there The summer before his last year at Morehouse in 1947, the 18-year-old King chose to enter the ministries. Throughout his time in college, King studied under the mentorship of its president, Baptist minister Benjamin Mays, who he would later credit with being his spiritual mentor. King had concluded that the church offered the most assuring way to answer an inner urge to serve humanity. His inner urge had begun developing, and he made peace with the Baptist church as he believed he would be a rational minister with sermons that were a respectable force for ideals, even social protest. King graduated from Morehouse with a Bachelor of Arts (BA) in sociology in 1948, age 19. Religious education. Let's see. Okay. It's religious education, ministry, and marriage and family. That's the Crozer Theological Seminole. Pretty big place. Pretty big college. That was in 2009 when that picture was taken. King enrolled in Crozer Theological Seminole in Upland, Pennsylvania. King's father fully supported his decision to continue his education and made arrangements for King to work with prominent Crozer alumni J. plus Barber, a family friend who pastored at Calvary Baptist Church in nearby Chester, Pennsylvania. King became known as one of the Sons of Calvary, an honor he shared with William Augustus Jones Jr. and Samuel D. Proctor, who both went on to become well known preachers in the black church. While attending Crozar, King was joined by Walter McCall, a former classmate at Morehouse. At Crozer, King was elected president of the student body. The African American students of Crozer, for the most part, conducted their social activity on Edward Street. King became fond of the street because the classmates had an aunt who prepared collard greens for them, which they both relished. King once reproved another student for keeping beer in his room, saying he had shared responsibility as African Americans to bear the burdens of the Negro race. For a time, he was interested in Walter Rauschenbusch's social gospel. In his third year of Kreutzer, King became romantically involved with a white daughter of an immigrant German woman who worked as a cook in the cafeteria. The woman had been involved with a professor prior to her relationship with King. King planned to marry her, but friends advised against it, saying that an interracial marriage would provoke animosity from both blacks and whites, potentially damaging his chances of ever pastoring a church in the South. King tearfully told a friend that he could not endure his mother's pain over the marriage and broke the relationship off 6 months later. He continued to have lingering feelings towards the woman. He left one week. He left one friend was quoted as saying he never recovered. King's graduate with a Bachelor of Divinity, a BDiv degree in 1951, Boston University, Boston University. In 1951, King began a doctoral studies in systematic theology at Boston University. While pursuing doctoral studies, King worked as an assistant minister at Boston's historical 12th Baptist Church with William Hunter. Hester was an old friend of King's father and was an important influence on King in Boston. King befriended a small cadre of local ministers his age and sometimes guest pastored at their churches, including Michael Haynes, associate pastor at 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury, and younger brother of jazz drummer Roy Haynes. The young man often held bull sessions in their various apartments discussing theology, sermon style, and social issues. King attended philosophy classes at Harvard University as an audit student in 1952. In 1953, at the age of 25, in 1954, King was called the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. King received his PhD degree on June 5th, 1955, with a dissertation initially supervised by Edgar S. Brinken, Brightman, by Edgar, immensely supervised by Edgar S. Brightman, and upon the letter's death by Lawton Harold D. Wolfe, titled A Comparison of the Conceptions of God in Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Willman, an academic inquiry in October 1991 concluded that portions of his doctoral dissertation had been plagiarized and he had acted improperly. However, despite his finding, the committee said that no thought should be given to the reconviction of Dr. King's doctoral degree. Yes, an action that the panel said will serve no purpose. The committee found that the dissertation still makes an intelligent contribution scholarship. A letter is now attached to the copy of King's dissertation held in the university library. Nothing that numerous passengers were were included without the appropriate quotations, and citations of sources. Significant debate exists on how to interpret King's plagiarism. Marriage, family. Let me. Okay, let me see. Okay, while studying at Boston University, he asked a friend from Atlanta named Mary Powell, who was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music, if she knew any nice Southern girls. Powell asked fellow student Coretta Scott if she was interested in meeting a Southern friend studying divinity. Scott was not interested in dating preachers, but eventually agreed to allow Martin to telephone her based on Powell's description and vouching. On their first phone call, King told Scott, "I am like Napoleon at Waterloo before your charms," so which she replied, "You haven't even met me." They went out for dates in his green Chevy. After the second date, King was certain Scott possessed the qualities he sought in a wife. She had been an active in Antidote in undergrad, where Carol and Rod Serling were schoolmates. King married Coretta on June 18th, 1953, on the lawn of her parents' house in her hometown of Helensburgh, Alabama. They became the parents of four children: Yolanda King, 1955 to 2007; Martin Luther King III, 1957; Dexter Scott King, 1961; and Bernice King, 1963. During their marriage, King limited Coretta's role in the civil rights movements. The civil rights movement. Expected her to be a housewife and mother. In December 1959, after being based in Montgomery for 5 years, King announced his return to Atlanta at the request of the SCLC in Atlanta. King served until his death as co-pastor with his father at the Ebenezer Baptist Church and helped expand the civil rights movement across the sea. So okay, activism and organization leadership. Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Of course, the image of another one of heroes, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks with King left in 1955. Oh yes, and Martin Luther King right there on the left. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, two of our heroes. In March 1955, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old black schoolgirl in Montgomery, refused to give up her bus seat to a white man in violation of Jim Crow laws, local laws in the southern United States that enforce racial segregation. King was on the committee for the Birmingham African American community that looked into the case. E.D. Nixon and Clifford Durr decided to wait for a better case to pursue because the incident involved a minor. 9 months later, on December 1st, 1955, a similar incident occurred when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus. The two incidents led to the Montgomery bus boycott, which was urged and planned by Nixon and led by King. King was in his 20s and had just taken up his clerical role. The other ministers asked him to take a leadership role simply because his relative newness to the community. Leadership made it easier for him to speak out. King was hesitant about it. King was hesitant about taking the role, but he decided to so do if no one else wanted to roll. The boycott lasted for 385 days, and the situation became not so tense that King's house was bombed. King was arrested and jailed during this campaign, which overnight drew the attention of national media and greatly increased King's public stature. The controversy ended when the United States District Court issued a ruling in the Browder versus Gale. The prohibited racial segregation on all Montgomery public buses. Blacks resumed riding the buses again and were able to sit in front with full legal authorization. King's role in the bus boycott transformed him into a national figure and the best known spokesman for the civil rights movement. Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1957, King, Ralph Albany, Fred Shuttleworth, Joseph Lowery, and other civil rights activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at SCLC. The group was created to harness the moral authority and organization power of black churches to conduct nonviolent protests in the service of civil rights reform. The group was inspired by the crusades of evangelist Billy Graham, who befriended King, as well as the national organization of the group and friendship founded by King Ellis, Stanley Levison, and Ella Baker. King led the SCLC until his death. The SCLC's 1957 prayer pilgrimage for freedom was the first time King addressed a national audience. Other civil rights leaders involved in the SCLC with King included James Bevel, Allen Johnson, Curtis W. Harris, Walter E. Finch, Fintroy, C.T. Vivian, Andrew Young, the Freedom Singers, Cleveland Robinson, Randolph Blackwell, Annie Bell Robinson, Devin Charles Kinsey, Steele Alfred Daniel Williams, King Benjamin Hooks, and Aaron Henry, and Barry Rustin, the Common Society. Harry, that's the next thing we're going into the Common Society. That's the next thing we're going to the Common Society. There we go. Harry Weichel joined King's legal advisor Clarence B. Jones in defending four ministers of the SCLC in the liberal case. New York Times, Cole v. Sullivan. The case was litigated in reference to the newspaper advertisement. Heed their advising voices. Rachel founded a tax-exempt fund to cover the suit's expenses and assist the nonviolent civil rights movement through a more effective means of fundraising. This organization was named the Gandhi Society for Human Rights. King served as honorary president for the group. He was displeased with the pace that President Kennedy was using to address the issue of segregation in 1962. King and the Gandhi Society produced a document that called on the president to follow in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln and issue an executive order to deliver a blow for civil rights as a kind of second emancipation proclamation. Kennedy did not execute the order. The FBI was underwritten the directive from Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy when it was began taping King's telephone line in fall of 1962. King was concerned that public allegations of communists in the SCLC would derail the administration's civil rights initiatives. He warned King to discontinue this association and later felt compelled to issue the written directive that authorized the FBI to wiretap King and other SCLC leaders. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover feared the civil rights movement and investigated the allegations of communist infiltration. Infiltration. When no evidence emerged to support this, interrogate the allegations of communist infiltration. When no evidence emerged to support this, the FBI used the incidental details caught on tape over the next 5 years in attempts to force King out of his leadership position in the Contel and CONTELPRO program. King believed that organized nonviolent protests against the system of Southern segregation known as Jim Crow laws would lead to extensive media coverage of the struggle for black equality and voting rights. Journalistic accounts and televised footage of the daily deprivation and indignities suffered by Southern blacks and of segregationist violence and harassment of civil rights workers and marchers produced a wave of sympathetic public opinion that convinced the majority of Americans that the civil rights movement was the most important issue in American politics in the early 1960s. King organized and led marches for blacks' right to vote, desegregation, you can rights to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other basic civil rights. Most of these rights were successfully enacted into the law of the United States with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mhm. Yeah. In the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the SCLC put into practice the tactics of nonviolent protest with great success by strategically choosing the methods and places in which protests were carried out. They were often dramatic standoffs with segregationist authorities who sometimes turned violent. The Survived knife attack in 1958. On September 20th, 1958, King was signing copies of his book, Stride Towards Freedom. In the Bloomington department store in Harlem when he narrowly escaped death. Izola Carey, a mentally ill black woman who thought that King was conspiring against her with communists, stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener, which nearly impinged on the urethra. King received first aid by police officers Al Howard and Philip Romero. King underwent emergency surgery with three doctors, Aubrey D. Lebrant, Maynard Emil Naclero, and John W. V. Cordes. He remained hospitalized for several weeks. Curry was later found mentally incompetent to stand trial. The Atlanta sit-down in prison sentence in the 1960 elections. The Georgia governor, Ernest Vandiver, expressed open hostility towards King's return to his hometown in late 1959. He claimed that where, wherever M.L. King Jr. has been, there has followed in his wake a wave of crimes, and followed and vowed to keep King under surveillance. On May 4th, 1960, several months after his return, King drove writer Lillian Smith to Emory University. Okay, University. When the police stopped him, King was cited for driving without a license because he had not yet been issued a Georgia license. King's Alabama license was still valid, and Georgia law did not mandate any time limit for issuing a local license. King paid a fine but was apparently unaware that his lawyer agreed to a plea deal that also included probationary sentence. Meanwhile, the Atlanta student movement had been acting to desegregate business pub businesses, public spaces, and the city organization, the Atlanta sit-ins, from March 1960 onwards. In August, the movement asked King to participate in a mass October sit-in, time to highlight how 1960 presidential election campaign had ignored civil rights. The day of action took place on October 19th. King participated in a sit-in at the restaurant inside Rich's, Atlanta's largest department store, and was among the many arrested that day. Authorities released everyone over the next few days, except for King, invoking his proprietary plea deal. Judge J. Oscar Mitchell sentenced King on October 25th to 4 months of hard labor before dawn. The next day, King was taken from his county jail cell and transported to a maximum security state prison. The arrest and harsh sentence drew nationwide attention. Many feared for King's safety as he started his prison sentence with people convicted of violent crimes, many of them white and hostile to his activism. Both presidential candidates were asked to weigh in at the time when both parties were courting the support of Southern whites and their political leadership, including Governor Vandiver Nixon, with whom King had a closer relationship prior to the sitting, declined to make a statement despite a personal visit from Jackie Robinson requesting his intervention. Nixon's opponent, John F. Kennedy, called the governor a Democrat directly and listed his brother Robert to exert more pressure on state authorities, and also at the professional request of Sergeant Shriver made a phone call to King's wife to express his sympathy and offer his help. The pressure from Kennedy and others proved effective, and King was released 2 days later. King's father decided to openly endorse Kennedy's candidacy for the November 8th election, which he narrowly won. Often after the October 19th sit-ins and following unrest, a 30-day truce was declared in Atlanta for desegregation negotiations. However, the negotiations failed and sit-ins and boycotts resumed in full swing for several months. On March 7, 1961, a group of black elders, including King, notified student leaders that a deal had been reached. The city's lunch counters would desegregate in fall 1961 in conjunction with the court mandated desegregation of schools. Many students were disappointed at the compromise. In a large meeting on March 10th at Warren Memorial Methodist Church, the audience was hostile and frustrated towards the elders and their compromise. King then gave a passionate speech calling participants to resist the cancer's disease or disunity and helping to calm tensions. Okay, let me see. A Burning Movement, 1961. The Burning Movement was desegregation coalition from Albany, Georgia, in November 1961. In December, King and the SCLC became involved. The movement mobilized thousands of citizens for a broad front nonviolent attack on every aspect of segregation within the city, attracted nationwide attention. When King first visited December 15th, 1961, he had planned to stay a day or so and return home. After giving counsel, the following day he was swept up in the mass arrest of peaceful demonstrators, and he declined bail until the city made concessions. According to King, the agreement was dishonored and violated by the city. After he left town, King returned in July 1962 and was given the option of 45 days in jail or a $178 fine, equivalent to 1,500 in 2020. He chose jail 3 days in his sentence. Police Chief Lloyd Pritchett discreetly arranged for King's fine to be paid and ordered his release. We had witness persons being kicked off lunch counter schools. We have witness persons being kicked off of lunch counter stools, e- ejected from churches, and thrown into jail. But for the first time, we witnessed being kicked out of jail. It was later acknowledged by the King Center that Billy Graham was the one who bailed King out of jail during this time. The Birmingham campaigns in 1963. King was arrested in 1963 for protesting the treatment of blacks in Birmingham on 18, in April 1963. The SCLC began campaign against racial segregation and economic injustice in Birmingham, Alabama. The campaign used nonviolent but initially confrontational tactics developed in part by Wyatt T. Walker. Black people in Birmingham organized with the SCLC, occupied public spaces with marches and sit-downs, openly violating laws that were considered unjust. King's intent was to provoke mass arrest and create a situation so crisis packed that it will inevitably open up the door to negotiation. It, basically, for the inevitably open up the door to negotiation. The campaign's early volunteers did not succeed in shutting down the city or in drawing media attention to the police actions over concerns of the uncertain. King SCLC strategist James Bevel changed the course of the campaign by recruiting children and young adults to join in the demonstrations. Newsweek called this strategy a children's crusade. Okay. During the protest, the Birmingham Police Department, led by Eugene Bull Connor, used high pressure water jets and police dogs against protesters, including children. Footage of the police response oh, it was broadcast to nation attention, shocking many white Americans and consolidating black Americans behind the movement. Not all of demonstrators were peaceful despite the avoid attentions of SCLC. In some cases, bystanders attacked the police, who responded with force. King and the SCLC were criticized for putting children in harm's way, but the campaign was a success. Connor lost his job, the Jim Crow signs came down, and public places became more open to blacks. King's reputation improved immensely. King was arrested and jailed early in the campaign, and his 13th arrest out of 29 from his cell, he composed the now famous letter from Birmingham jail that responds to calls on the movement to pursue legal channels for social change. The letter has been described as one of the most important historical documents penned by a modern political prisoner. King argues that the crisis of racism is too urgent in the current system to entrenched. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. He points out the Boston Tea Party and celebrated acts of rebellion. Scratch my knee a little bit. Okay. Voluntary given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. He points out that Boston Tea Party, a celebrated act of rebellion in American colonies, was illegal. Civilian disobedience that conservatively everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal. Walter Reuther, president of the United Auto Workers, arranged a $160,000 to bail out King and his fellow protesters. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but a white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace with its absence of tension to a positive peace with which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods. To direct action, who particularly believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concert, a time who constantly advises the Negro to wait for more convergent seasons. And that's Martin Luther King right there in the middle. The March of Washington, 1963. King representation. King representing the SCLC was among the leaders of the Big Six, civil rights organization who were instrumental in the organization Jobs and Freedom, which took place on August 28, 1963. The other leaders of the organization comparison the Big Six were Roy Wilkins from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise NAACP, Whitney Young, National Urban League, Philip Randolph Brotherhood of Sleeper Cars, otherwise BOSC, Porters, John Lewis, SNCC, and James L. Former Jr. of the Congress of Racial Equality. Kennedy initially opposed the march outright because he was concerned it would negatively impact the drive for passage of civil rights legalization. However, the organizers were firm that the march should proceed with the march going forward. The Kennedys decided it was important to work to ensure its success. President Kennedy was concerned the turnout would be less than 100,000. Therefore, he enlisted the aid of additional church leaders and Walter Reuther, president of the United Automobile Workers, to help mobilize demonstrators and the cause. The march originally was conceived as an event to dramatize the desperate condition of blacks in the southern U.S. and an opportunity to place organizers' concerns and grievances squarely before the seat of the power in the nation's capital. Organizers tend to denounce the federal government for its failure to safeguard the civil rights and physical safety of civil rights workers. In blacks, the group acquiesced to presidential pressure and influence, and the event ultimately took on a far less strident tone. As a result, some civil rights activists felt its presence an inaccurate, sanitized pageant of racial harmony. Malcolm X called it the farce of Washington, and the Nation of Islam forbid its members from attending the march. I have a dream. My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day a little snippet. To watch the rest, you can go and look at your local channels to hear the rest of the speech. The march made specific demands an end to racial segregation in public schools. Meanwhile, meaningful civil rights legislations, including the no prohibited racial discrimination and employment protection of civil rights workers from police brutality, a $2 minimum wage for all workers, equivalent to $17 in 2017, and self-government for Washington, D.C., then governed by congressional committee. Despite tensions in the march, was a resounding success. More than a quarter of a million people of diverse ethnicities, yeah, attended the event. Yeah, it's ethnicities, that's the word. Attended the event sprawling from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial onto the National Mall and around the reflection pool. At the time, it was the largest gathering of protesters in Washington, D.C.'s history. I Have a Dream. King delivered a 17-minute speech, later known as I Have a Dream, in the speech's most famous passage, in which he departed from his prepared text, possibly at the promoting of Mahalia Jackson, who shouted behind him, "Tell them about the dream." King said, "I say today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today, tomorrow I still have a dream. It's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day that our nations will rise and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, this a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racist and his governor having his lips dripping with the words of interperson and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, the little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream came to be regarded as one of the finest speeches in the history of American oratory. The march and especially King's speech helped put civil rights atop agenda and reformers in the United States. For this felicitated passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. New York, 1964. On February 6, 1964, King delivered the inaugural speech of the lecture series, and that initiated new school. Initiated at the new school, called the American Race Crisis in August 2013. Almost 50 years later, the school discovered an audio tape with 15 minutes of a question and answer session that followed King's address. In these remarks, King referred to a conversation he had recently had with Joelle Nuhu, in which he compared the sad condition of many African Americans to the India's untouchables. The original speech recording is part of the collection of audio tapes in the Amherst College archives. In special collections in 1989, Dr. King's speech had been rebroadcast on Amherst student-run radio station WAMF, now WAMH. The tape was digitalized in the fall of 2015 and shared with the new school archives in his March 18, 1964 interview by Robert Penn Warren. King compared his activism to his father's, citing his training in nonviolence as a key difference. He also discussed the next phase of the civil rights movement in Instagram, Summer Voting Rights Movement, and Bloody Sunday 1965. December 1965, King of the SCLZ joined forces with Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee (SNCC) in Selma, Alabama, where the SNCC had been working on voters registration for several months. A local judge issued an injunction that buried any gathering of three or more people affiliated with the SNCC, SCLC, DCVL, or any of 41 named civil rights leaders. Injunction temporarily halted civil rights activity into King defied it by speaking at Brown Chapel on January 2nd, 1965, during the 1965 March to Montgomery, Alabama. Violence by police and others against peaceful marches resulted in much publicity, which made racism in Alabama visible nation. Acting on James Bevel call for a march from Selma to Montgomery, Bevel and other SCLC members that partially collaborated with SNCC attended to organize a march to the state's capital. The first attempt to march on March 7th, 1965, at the which King was not present, was aborted because of mob and police violence against the demonstrators. This day has become known as Bloody Sunday and was a major turning point in an effort to gain public support for the civil rights movement. It was the clearest demonstration up to the time of the dramatic potential of King's and Bevel's nonviolent strategy. On March 5th, King met with officials in the Johnson administration in order to request an injunction against the persecution of the demonstrators. He did not attend the march due to church duties, but he later wrote, "If I had any idea that the state troopers would use this kind of brutality they did, I would have felt compelled to give up my church duties altogether to lead the line." Footage of police brutality against the protesters was broadcast extensively and aroused national outrage. King's next attempt to organize March 9th SCLC petitioned a junction to federal court against the state of Alabama. This was denied, and judge issued an order blocking the march until after a hearing. Nonetheless, King led marches on March 9th to Ahmaud Pettus Bridge. Yeah. So, Chicago Open House Movement, 1966, and after several success in the South, King revealed to others in the civil rights organization took the movement to the north of Chicago, and their first destination, King Ralph Abernathy, both from the middle class, moved to building 1550 South Hamlin Avenue in the slums of North Lawndale and Chicago's West Side as an educational experience to demonstrate their support and empathy for the poor. King later stated Albany voted the movement and received a worse reception in Chicago than the South marches, especially one through Marquette Park on August 5th, 1965. August 5th, 1966, where he met with throwing bottles, screaming thrones, rioting. Well, he's met by throwing bottles, and screaming thrones, rioting, seeming very possible. King's belief militated against the staging of violence, against his staging of violent event, and he negotiated an agreement with Mayor Richard J. Daley. See, the opposing the Vietnam War, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all its intelligent flaws, racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systematic rather than superficial flaws and suggests the radical reconstruction of society itself is a real issue to be faced. Martin Jr. We must recognize that we can't solve our problems with now until its radical retribution of economic and political power. This means revolution of values, other things. We must see now the evils of racism, economic exploration, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American Life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order. Martin Luther King. During the April 4th, 1967 appearance at the New York City Riverside Church, exactly 1 year before his death, King delivered a speech titled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. He spoke strongly against the U.S. role in the war, was a, arguing the U.S. was in Vietnam to occupy it as an American colony, and calling the U.S. government the greatest provider of violence in the world today. He connected the war with economic injustice, arguing that the country needed a serious moral. The true revolution of values will soon look easily on clear and contrast poverty, wealth with righteous conditions, and will look across the seas and visually capitalize Western investment in huge African. King opposed the Vietnam War, sons of Asia, Africa, and Southern America taking profits out with no concern, social betterment countries, and just not just. The assassination aftermath. On March 29, 1968, King went to Memphis, Tennessee in support of the black sanitary public works employees who were represented as the AFSCME Local 1733. The workers had been on strike since March 12th for higher wages and better treatment. In one incident, black street repair men received pay for 2 hours when they were sent home because of bad weather, but white employees were paid for the full day. On April 3rd, the king addressed a rally and delivered his I've been to the mountaintop address at Mason's Temple, the world headquarters of the Church of God in Christ. King's flight to Memphis had been delayed by a bomb threat against his plane. In the prophetic perspiration last speech of his life is a reference to the bomb threat. King said the following. Let me just skip that. King was booked for room 306 in Lorraine Motel owned by Walter Bailey in Memphis. Ralph Aberney, who was present at the assassination, testified the United States House Select Committee assassinations. The king and his entourage stayed at home 306 so often. Stayed in room 306 so often it was known as King's obituary suite. According to Jesse Jackson, who was present, King's last words on the balcony for his assassination were spoken to musician Ben Branch, who was scheduled to perform that night at the event. King was attending. Ben, make sure you play Take My Hand, Precious Lord in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty. King was fatally shot by James Earl Ray at 6:01 p.m. Thursday, April 4th, 1968, as he stood on the motel's second floor balcony. The bullet entered through his right cheek, smashing his jaw, then traveled down to his spinal cord before lodging in his shoulder. I barely heard the shot at Bethany, Bethany, Bethany heard the shot from inside the motel room and ran to the balcony to find King on the floor. Jackson stated after shooting that he cradled King's head as King lay on the balcony, but this account was disputed by other colleagues of King. Jackson later changed his statement to say that he had reached out for King. After emergency chest surgery, King died at St. Joseph's Hospital at 17:05 p.m. According to biographer Taylor Brents, King's autopsy revealed through only 39 years old he had the heart of a 60-year-old, which Brents attributed to the stress of his 13 years in the civil rights movement. King was initially interred in South View Cemetery in South Atlanta, but in 1977 his remains were transferred to the tomb on the site of Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park. Assassination led to a nationwide rave of race riots in Washington D.C., Chicago, and Washington D.C. and Chicago. Chicago battle. Assassination led to a nationwide wave of race riots in Washington D.C., Chicago, Baltimore, Louisville, Kansas City, and dozens of other cities. Presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy was on his way to the Annapolis campaign rally when he was informed of King's death. He gave a short and proud speech. 2 months after King's death, James Earl Ray, who was loose from previous prison escapes, was captured at London Heathrow Airport by trying to leave England on a false Canadian passport. He was using alias Roman George Snide on his way white rural Reseda. Ray was quickly extradited to Tennessee and charged with King's murder. He confessed to the assassination on March 10th, 1969. Though he recanted the confession 3 days later, and the vice attorney Percy Foreman, Ray pleaded guilty to avoid trial conviction, and he was sentenced to 99 years prison term and claimed he met in Montreal, Quebec. His legacy. King's legacy includes influences on the Black conscious movement, the civil rights movement in South Africa. King's work was cited by and served as an interpretation for South African leader Albert Literley, who fought for racial justice in his country during apartheid and was later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The United Kingdom. King influenced Irish politician and activist John Hume. Hume, the former leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, cited King's legacy as quintessential to the Northern Irish civil rights movement in the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, calling him one of the great heroes of the century. The United States. King has become a national icon in the history of American liberalism and American progressiveness. Its main legacy was to secure progress of civil rights in the U.S. Just days after assassination, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, titled V11. I think they probably 15 or something. I don't know my Roman numerals like that. The act, commonly known as the Fair Housing Act, prohibited discrimination in housing and housing-related transactions. Civil Rights Act of 1968. Discrimination housing-related transactions based on race, religion, or national origin, later expanded to include sex, familial status, and disability. This legislation has seen as a tribute to King's struggle the final years to combat unconditional discrimination in the U.S. King's wife, Coretta Scott King, followed in her husband's footsteps and was active in matters of social justice and civil rights until her death in 2006. The same year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, she established the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And that's the story of Martin Luther King. Thank y'all, and God bless.